Welcome back, guys, to the last lecture before the break. Woohoo! Cheers, cheers, and cheers. Yes, shouts of joy and cheer. You guys have done great work the last week, and I'm really pleased with the progress. Great notes. So I can only thank you for the work that you've done. I hope some of this makes sense. Please, if you have questions, jot them down. So let's take a look at World War I and the end of World War I. I do want to make a quick, brief stop at advertising and the war. This is something that we talked about and saw today in class with the great propaganda posters that we analyzed together. These propaganda posters were the work of what was known as the Committee on Public Information. And this committee was created in 1917 in April, the same month we declare war. So the United States government realized that once it declared war and enters the war, that we're going to have to convince the American public that war was the right thing to do and that the American people needed to have an understanding of why we were at war. And so the Committee on Public Information creates pamphlets, billboards, movies, posters, and 75,000 four-minute men who delivered really passionate 4-minute speeches in support of the war. So this 75,000 4-minute men thing is really an interesting idea. And the goal, again, was to promote national unity, patriotism, to characterize the Germans as depraved beasts that were out to undermine and attack Western civilization, including the United States again. And lastly, the 4-minute speeches and all the other propaganda materials were designed to promote Wilson's idea of making the world safe for democracy, something that we'll see again. There were also limitations on speech. There was a 1917 Espionage Act that led to certain people being accused of spying against the United States and greatly expanded the definition of spying to include activities that really weren't spying at all, but allowed the government to round up the usual suspects, if you will, and put them in jail. There was an Alien Act of 1918, but the really big act that I want to focus on just briefly is the 1918 Sedition Act that prohibited any utterance, that is speech, printing, writing, publishing of any disloyal or profane, scurrilous, abusive language. Scurrilous is a wonderful word that just means bad language about the United States or its armed forces. So nobody could say really anything bad about the United States government, government officials, including the president, and or the armed forces. One unfortunate soul was overheard to say this, and I quote, "Wilson is a wood-headed son of a bitch," end quote. That is scurrilous and profane language, not language I typically use, but this individual was overheard saying this, and it landed him in jail for violating the Sedition Act. Well, some in America felt that these acts passed by the government, these laws, that is, violated free speech that is protected in our Bill of Rights, Amendment Number 1. So there's a famous court case called Schenck, don't worry about the spelling, versus the United States. And the court actually sided with the government and said the government is allowed to legally limit our speech in certain circumstances. And the test to determine those circumstances was this: if a clear and present danger existed to the United States. That is, if speech represented a clear and present danger, then the speech was not allowed. So there are, despite these women protesting outside the White House, which is kind of really cool, they're really dressed nicely too, I think, right? Look at that fashion. Let's bring that back maybe, huh? Anyway, the women were trying to remind President Wilson of their First Amendment rights. However, many were, in fact, hauled away to jail, including the leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, for criticizing the war, as well as other prominent anarchists, Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, who we've seen in the past, ran afoul of this law. So let's move on to, again, World War I. Let's talk about the army in France. The end of World War I came in November, on November 11, 1918, after Germany had that year launched two final last-ditch assaults on Allied lines. And remember, that's after Russia dropped out of the war because Russia had gone over to the communists, and the communists felt that the war was not worth fighting any longer. So Germany was able to reposition its troops from the Russian front to the Western Front, and they launched these two major attacks in the spring and summer of 1918. However, the difference this time was American troops. Now, the Germans did succeed remarkably in pushing the front that had not moved in 4 years or 3.5 years. The Germans pushed the front back towards Paris, and it seemed as though they were going to actually break through. Yet, who proved to be the difference? The American troops arriving. Now, these American troops were, in fact, badly trained. They were ill-equipped, and they didn't know what they were doing either. They weren't really ready or prepared for the type of warfare that is trench warfare. Yet there were enough of them, and more were arriving daily in France, that they were able to really make the difference and stem or stop the German attack. So kudos to the American troops. Now, the American troops suffered heavy losses. And I just want to point out two of the theaters of war, the battlefields, that is, Belleau Wood there on the left, and Château-Thierry there on the right, down towards the bottom. They're both circled. There was also Fer-en-Tardenois a little bit farther north, and you see up towards Soissons American troops. So anywhere you see those blue stars, those were areas where American troops were engaged in fighting the Germans. So at this point, the United States and the Allies are able to stop the Germans, and in the fall, that is August, September, and October of 1918, the Allied troops with the Americans launch a series of counterattacks that push Germany back towards, push the German soldiers, rather, back towards Germany. Though the Germans actually agreed to end fighting before they actually were pushed back into Germany. So the question of whether Germany was defeated is a good question. It's out there. It's widely debated, and there's really no consensus on that, though clearly a small corporal from Austria by the name of Adolf Hitler was going to assert very strongly and stridently that Germany was not defeated, that the Allies never conquered in full the German military, the German army, and that the Allies never occupied Germany. And this is all true. The German army did march back home with all of its weapons, all of its equipment in good standing. So a really interesting thing. Now, what allowed Germany to get out of this deadly 4-year war? Well, it was President Wilson and his 14 points. And you just remember that the 14 points are sort of based on this idea of American exceptionalism. The idea that, again, America and its people were exceptional in that they were different from other nations and people. How so? Well, Americans had the longest surviving democracy, a government based on the consent of the people. America was a diverse nation, taking peoples from all over the world. America was a prosperous nation with booming industry, with large banks, and an important financial player, obviously, in the world. America also had some of the most productive farms in the world. So Wilson believes truly that America had a lesson to teach the rest of the world about how to organize and govern a society, about how people could best work, and his ideas, again, lead to this idea of exceptionalism. And we remember, too, that Wilson was a deeply moralistic and religious man. And he really, in a way, connects back to those original Puritans who settled Massachusetts all the way back in 1630 with the idea, and maybe you don't remember this from other history classes, but the Puritan idea was to come to the New World, Massachusetts, and create a more perfect society. And the Puritans called this idea, this experiment, a city on a hill that would be a shining example for others to copy. And so Wilson heads to Europe with the 14 points in his pocket, if you will, this grand plan to reshape not only Europe but the world according to exceptional American ideas and values. So that's the idea. So what about these 14 points? Well, let's look at just a couple of the big ideas. We won't list each point by point. It gets a little tedious and dry. We don't need to do that. But Wilson's points included such things as freedom of the seas, free trade, open covenants openly arrived at, no more secret treaties. Wilson believed in self-determination, a phrase, self-determination, that just means government by the consent of the governed, or government by the people, for the people, and of the people, which we call democracy or constitutional democracy. Wilson also believed that national borders should reflect national origins. The idea of big, large empires, and remember, empire is one nation controlling many other nations, was outdated, was old, led to conflict, led to serious tension in the world. So get rid of empires, replace them with new states, and let those new states, again, be based on self-determination or the consent of the governed, that is, democratic nations. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of the 14 points. But the last and biggest of the 14 points, point number 14, was Wilson's brainchild, and that was an association of nations to keep peace and work out all disputes between member nations. And this was to be called the League of Nations. And at the heart of the League of Nations was a little article, and the League of Nations had many articles in its bylaws, but Article 10 of the League of Nations, Article 10 of the League of Nations said all member nations pledge to come to the aid of another member nation that had been attacked. So if there were a nation not part of the League of Nations, okay, and that nation were to attack a member nation, all members of the League would be obligated to send military assistance to help that nation out. And Wilson really believed that if the League of Nations were going to work, that it had to have teeth. That is, there had to be a real and credible threat of military action for the League of Nations to really be a viable body. So that's the 14 points in synopsis, in a nutshell. Wilson headed off to Europe, to Paris, in December of 1919 to attend the Paris Peace Conference. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919, and it concluded its work in June 1919. So in a 6-month span, Wilson spent a lot of time in Paris. The negotiations to deal with Germany in particular were held at a very famous chateau created by Louis XIV, Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and Louis XV. That chateau is known as Versailles. So the peace treaty with Germany is known as the Treaty of Versailles. The idea was for Wilson to arrange a peace based on his 14 points to prevent wars, to promote democracy. However, Wilson ran into the European leaders, especially the Allied leaders of Italy that had joined the war on the Allied side, of France and England. And France and England and Italy really came with sharpened knives in their hands. They wanted to exact revenge. They wanted to punish Germany at all costs. Wilson did not want this, of course, but he also wanted his League of Nations. So there was a negotiation. One side wants one thing, the other side wants another, and they agree to exchange certain things. So what does Wilson give up in order to get his cherished League of Nations? Well, he accepts a clause in the Treaty of Versailles, number 231, that assigned all the guilt for World War I to Germany. The interesting thing is Germany's not even invited to the peace conference, so they're not even there to participate or to promote or defend themselves. They're simply going to have to take what is given to them. In addition to this war guilt clause, France and England want another clause. That's number 232. It's actually the last clause. It says Germany will pay cash payments in reparation for all the damage caused by the war. And the initial amount of reparations payments, as they were known, was $33 billion. And there would be another conference that met in 1921, 2 years later, to establish a final amount, which increased the amount of money that Germany would have to pay back. Wilson also lost the idea to dismantle big empires, and he lost the fight to keep the Middle East from becoming gobbled up by European nations. So the Middle East is going to be divided up and carved up by European nations. Now, Wilson comes home after these lengthy talks in Europe, where he's been sort of criticized. He doesn't listen to the European leaders. They don't listen to him. They come up with this sort of compromise. Wilson has to bring the treaty home. And remember that any treaty negotiated by the United States has to be ratified by the Senate. Now, in 1918, the United States Senate, in the elections of that year, went to the Republican Party. Wilson's a Democrat. The Republicans control the Senate. The Republicans don't really want to do business with Wilson. In fact, the Republicans had asked to travel to Paris with Wilson. Wilson rejected them, so they were already upset. The Republicans don't like Article 10 of the League of Nations because they feel like it gives too much power to this international body to declare war. So that's where we are. We reject the treaty. That's it, guys. Have a great break.